Welcome, all of you. I think people still coming in thick and fast, but we only have an hour, so I'm going to start speaking anyway. It's lovely to see you all on this hot day. I know there are a number of different events going on, so we feel particularly honoured that you've come to join us here today for this joint Lyons Learning Project Jewish Renaissance programme, something of a groundbreaking series, I think, where, because Black Jewish Lives, we're going to be looking at the experience of Black Jews in this country and also at several very different communities in East, West, and Southern Africa. It's interesting how a casual remark can sometimes totally change one's perceptions. And this happened to me some years ago when I was at a Catholic rectors conference in Rome. I'd been asked to talk about the Jewish roots of Christianity, and I thought it was quite a good talk that I gave about how vital Judaism was to Christianity, not only the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible as its basis, but that actually Christianity defines itself in opposition to Judaism. And at the end of it, a young Ghanaian priest stood up and said, "I was an animist until I was 19. What has Judaism got to do with me?" And of course he was right, and I couldn't answer it. And then I thought that, well, of course, the problem is that Christianity is so Eurocentric. It doesn't really take into account the fact that most of its worldwide worshippers have a totally different experience of what Christianity is than what goes on in Europe. And then, of course, I thought, hang on, what about Judaism? We think of Judaism as being a European religion, in spite of its origins in the Middle East and its development, of course, in Iraq, in Babylon, as it was then. The Ashkenazification, as Stephen Bush talks about it. We have been so used to seeing only one small sliver of Judaism, as if it was the whole of Judaism. And I think it was the events that led up to the killing of George Floyd and the resultant look at the racial prejudice that is still so prominent, not only in America, but in this country, which led to the looking at our own Jewish community to see how easy it is to make assumptions about who is a Jew, what a Jew looks like, where a Jew comes from. And this series is really an attempt to address that issue and to look at the challenge that it's not just the matter of absorbing Jews of different racial and cultural backgrounds into the Jewish establishment here in the UK, but it's a recognition of their authentic religious right to be Jewish in a way that their ancestors may have been, and realize the wealth and strength that this rich variety can contribute to the Jewish community as a whole. And this, of course, is where the Bush report comes in. And so it is a great honor and a pleasure to have with us today Mary van der Zil, the president of the Board of Deputies, who commissioned the report, and Stephen Bush, who is its author. Before I hand over to Marie, just a couple of things. One is, I know there are a lot of conflicting things going on, particularly the football and the tennis. Please, can I ask nobody, either in the chat or in the questions or in the comments, say anything about the score. Otherwise, we will have some very angry people here today. You will have an opportunity to ask questions. I'll ask you please to put them into the chat, and I will then, when we come to the questions, I will unmute you or ask you to unmute yourself to ask the question. But if you can put them into the chat in the first place, that would be a great help. And so, without further ado, I will hand over to Marie to tell us something about the Bush report.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Sybil, and thank you to the Lyons Learning Project for hosting this very important discussion this evening. In the difficult days and weeks following the brutal, racist murder of George Floyd, societies on both sides of the Atlantic faced a reckoning about the treatment of Black people everywhere and the undeniable reality of systematic racism and discrimination. And at the Board of Deputies of British Jews, it was, of course, right for us to condemn the racist murder of Mr. Floyd. But we could not stop there, because no community is immune from the scourge of prejudice, and our community is no exception. And as society as a whole sought to examine racial diversity, Black members of our own community came forward and told us that while there were many wonderful things about being Black and Jewish, they experienced far too many instances of marginalization and discrimination. And then other minorities in our community, they also stepped forward and said they too had many similar experiences. And we realized that alongside calling for change in wider society, we needed to first act to understand what was happening in our own community and seek to improve things here as well. And that's how the Commission on Racial Inclusivity in the Jewish community was born. And when we asked the very eminent journalist, Stephen Bush, and welcome Stephen, to chair the commission, he agreed to take on something which was entirely unprecedented. And to our knowledge, this is not only the first time that any national representative body of a Jewish community has looked inwards and undertaken an audit of the racism within its own walls, but one of the first times a cultural or ethnic minority in any country has done so. So this was a real challenge. And there were also the combined challenges of defining the Commission's terms, listening to witnesses, consulting communal stakeholders, and producing deliverable recommendations for organisations that, to be frank, are heavily dependent on volunteers, and most at times might have found these things insurmountable. But thanks to Stephen Bush's immense skill and generosity with his time, in April, we have been able to share the Commission's findings in full. And the fact that we released the report on this year's Stephen Lawrence Day, and in the week that George Floyd's murderer had been found guilty, that felt particularly poignant. And to me, this is a moment filled with both pride and also great sadness. I'm proud that as a community, we're taking ownership of these challenges, and that institutions throughout our community have not sought to dodge the problems to them that were put by the Commission. And instead, we've really seen an outpouring of goodwill, a willingness to learn and to improve. The way that our communal institutions have responded is truly admirable, and that makes me proud to be a British Jew. But I'm very saddened and I'm very sorry about the discrimination that people have suffered within our community, which proved that such a commission was necessary in the first place. I've been incredibly moved by many of the witness testimonies, particularly the difficult experience faced by some converts, the racial profiling faced by many people at the doors of communal venues, and the marginalization faced by some young people in our Jewish schools. And indeed, it could be very well argued that this commission was long overdue, and I agree. The report also makes difficult readings at times, and its recommendations are certainly very challenging. But the commission was the right thing to do, and I invite the whole community, please all read the report very carefully and consider the implications. Standing still is just not an option. And when we look back on this period, I want to say that we were the generation that grasped this problem and made our community a much more inclusive and welcoming space for all its members. And I want to end this part of the evening by speaking directly to anyone watching who came forward and entrusted the Commission with your testimonies. It's plainly evident that you care passionately about the future of the Jewish community as much as I do. And we know that much work still remains to be done, but it's thanks to you that the Jewish community of Britain is one step further along its journey to becoming completely welcoming and inclusive to all. And lastly, I want to thank Stephen for all of his exceptional work. The entire Jewish community is deeply in his debt. And we're going to have a conversation shortly with Stephen, and then I know that Rabbi Sybil is going to ask Stephen some more questions. So Stephen, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's very good of you with your time, and we're immensely grateful to you. So thank you for agreeing to answer some questions. So can I ask you, you've said in your report that it took a lot of courage for people to come forward and to share their experiences. And I felt that many of the testimonies were quite upsetting to read. Did you find any testimonies particularly disturbing, or is there any particular testimony that really sticks out in your mind?
Well, no, thank you both for that very kind introduction. But also, I think lots of the testimony was difficult to hear, and some of it was very challenging. But I think that the ones that have stuck with me the most and the ones I found hardest were one, piece of testimony that's in the report concerning a woman and her carer and how they were treated. The woman has, the woman has comparatively recently has died, but had died before the report had even been thought of, and she is therefore the only witness who did not get to read the report. And then the other bits of testimony I found most difficult were ones which were either obviously outside of our scope, but clearly met a great deal to our witnesses. And I talk a lot about the fact one of the, it was a prophetic act by you and by the board to set this up. But one of the things which is difficult is, as you say, for some people, they'd been waiting a very long time and they were talking about things that had happened to them some way in the past, and I therefore couldn't really usefully propose meaningful redress. And I suppose the reason why that sort of testimony was more difficult for me personally is, with everything else, I knew that if I did a good job with the final report, then people who'd testified would be able to feel that they had done so for a reason. And I hope, obviously, I'm not vain enough to think the report is perfect, but I hope that for our witnesses, they look at the finished document and they feel that the immense leap of faith and the immense amount of bravery they showed in giving evidence has been at least partially rewarded. What I found difficult with the people who I knew right from the off would not be able to have that moment of having that moment of reward and recognition. And I think that's definitely the thing which has stayed the most deeply with me, which is one of the reasons why there are these recommendations about listening exercises. But yes, it was actually the historical stuff was the hardest, because it was the stuff where I couldn't, you can't go back in time and say, hey, here are better ways we could have conducted ourselves in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's not particularly useful for a report to go over that ground extensively. But that's also therefore the most difficult thing, because it's the stuff where I'm being the least useful as Commission Chair.
Oh, look, one of the very positive things we've heard is that the process of the Commission did give some witnesses an opportunity to hear from other people who had similar experiences. And that's good, because they no longer felt isolated. Did you feel that you heard any testimonies that absolutely resonated with your own personal experiences of racism? And can you give us any examples to put this in context?
Yeah, it's odd. So lots of the testimony did sort of resonate with me personally. sometimes it resonated because it exposed things that I myself do that I should knock off. So, I, for example, I'm mixed race. I have multiple ethnicities, but my Jewish side is Ashkenazi, and I do tend to drift into kind of assuming that my family story of we arrived here in the middle of the 19th century and we moved out of the East End, and my mother moved back into the East End, and my great granddad was furious because he'd spent his whole life clambering out of the East End only for her to clamber right back in. And it's a story I'm very proud of, and I think those of us who our story should be proud of. But realizing the number of times that I'd kind of just assumed that was the default, and then having to reflect on the fact that in the wider community of the United Kingdom, when people assume, because, I don't have an African name, well, I don't have an African name. I was going to have a Jewish name. That's not really true. I have a name that a Jewish man changed to Bush because he was very worried about global political events in the 1930s. But, kind of then realizing the annoyance that I feel when someone goes, "Oh yeah, did you come here from the 50s, from the Caribbean?" is a similar version of something that I have been doing to people who are Sephardi or Mizrahi my whole life. When I do of course, we all came to the East End, and then et cetera, et cetera. And then the kind of experience of people kind of going, "Oh, well, you don't look Jewish," and realizing, "Oh, God, yeah, that is annoying when people do that." And I think so those were kind of the two things, both something that I do myself a lot, and it was kind of slightly strange to have it reflected back on me, which made me realize I had to reflect on how I talk about my own history and my own experiences if it's universal. And then one which was kind of a great commonality of realizing, oh yeah, that is annoying, and that is something that does happen to me.
I think you said at the start of the commission that you were unsure if you were Jewish enough or black enough to lead the project. Do you still feel that way? And how have your feelings changed, or what do you think has made you feel different?
Well, yes, I'm going to give a very Jewish answer, which is, on the one hand, yes, I do feel like that, and on the other hand, no. I think so. On the one hand, I'll start with that. On the one hand, I don't, because one of the things which has been very humbling and very useful about this process, as someone who, as I think lots of us who our Jewishness is primarily an ethnic identity, do quite a lot without kind of necessarily thinking about it. At the start of this process, Jewishness was profoundly an ethnic identity for me. It was a family story, a recipe, kind of token observance of some things, trips to Cambridge to see my great aunt and uncle, continual sort of, oh yes, I will come and see you in Israel this year, I promise. Yeah, but it was an ethnic identity, unfortunately for someone who's on the left, something that was most particularly painful over the last 5 years in terms of my relationship personally with the Labour Party. But it was something which I would kind of say in a slightly dismissive way that I now find a bit embarrassing. Oh, well, I don't believe in any of that stuff. But one of the things which has been hugely humbling about this process is in addition to our witness testimony, we've had a huge amount of work with stakeholders and a huge amount of, therefore, rabbinical wisdom from across our denominations. And I, as a result of this process, I've had to refamiliarize myself with the text, to the extent that I even now have a pocket JPS Bible that I carry around with me. Now, I'm afraid I still don't believe in any of it, but I do think I've gained a deeper sense of my Jewishness as a spiritual identity. So that's, on the one hand, I feel significantly more Jewish at the start of this process than I did at the end. On the other hand, no, and this has actually been another thing that has been very positive, is that a decade ago, and indeed a very good friend sent me a very nice message when the report came out, because I've urged student organizations in particular to sort of proactively try and find the Jews on campus, and not to sort of assume that someone, if they look a certain way, isn't. And a very good friend of mine pointed out that when we were at university, we were in some some debate in some kind of left-wing organization, as I spent a lot of my time at university doing, and someone said something thoughtful, and I felt, well, someone said, I'll be more generous. Someone said something I thought was thoughtful and crass about Israel-Palestine. And I did, well, look, it's more complicated than that. And I sort of launched into it. And my ancestors this and my ancestors that. And this person spent the best part of 2 terms trying to get me to come to Friday dinner, trying to get me to come to synagogue. And I was like, please stop bothering me. I'm not interested in this. And they pointed out, and they've had the last laugh, because over a decade later, I've written a report going, they had the right idea and they were right to keep bothering me. But the thing I felt a decade ago is I had a very strong sense of myself as having a mixed race identity. Not half black, not half Jewish, but a third identity that was a source of huge pride to me. And the thing that's been difficult about the last decade is covering British politics. Although our MPs are actually quite diverse, the people who cover it aren't. So I felt incredibly black. I would feel eccentric sometimes, when the BBC phones you up and goes, oh, there's some race-related issue, and I go, well, actually, shouldn't you get a black person? You could tell they'd think, is Stephen making some kind of weird point here? And kind of losing that aspect of myself. And feeling more Jewish because of the awful 5 years than we've had. And the nice thing about this process, where we have people who like me, mixed race, people who are adopted, people who are converts, or people who are from either the Ethiopian, Sephardi, or Mizrahi diasporas, is regaining my sense of my third identity as mixed race. So that's why I guess is yes and no. I think the really positive thing for me about this process is I do feel both more relaxed in my Jewish identity, but also more relaxed and affirmed in my third mixed race identity, again, as a result of having done this process.
Thank you. You've mentioned that there was, I think, a huge diversity of views you felt from the witnesses that you'd heard from. How did you manage to acknowledge this, perhaps to them, whilst you were still making solid recommendations, or acknowledge it to anybody? How did you deal with the diversity of views? Because we all know we've got 2 Jews, 10 opinions. So what happened?
So this was one of the real challenges to me, because I mean, I was about to say as we all, but maybe actually it's just that I'm incredibly egocentric. Going into this, I realized my sort of underlying assumption was, the majority of our witnesses will be fairly like me in one way or the other. Essentially, the vast majority of our witnesses will be mixed race like me, and there'll be a kind of handful of witnesses who are kind of from either the Ethiopian or Mizrahi diasporas, and there'll be a handful of witnesses who are converts. But broadly, I hadn't really thought about the fact that, of course, our witnesses are a perfect soil sample of the British Jewish community, and they didn't agree about anything. I mean, not quite anything, but it did feel like that at times. And I think the thing that I really I hope I did well in the report was the way to do it was just to acknowledge right from the off, including, because obviously with things, none of us see ourselves solely through our protected characteristics, right? We kind of don't go, well, I think this as a mixed race person, or this as a non-observant Jew, or this as no one thinks of themselves in that way, which meant that there were bits, in order to capture the complexity, I had to slightly bend my own rules in terms of what was in our scope. So for example, in terms of hosting speakers, if I had kept to a very narrow concept of, well, what type of speaker complaint would you have to make to be included, it would have created the impression of unity among our witnesses, where it did not exist, which I think would have been unfair and inappropriate. For the most part, the thing I hope so to be honest, the thing I think I could have done a better job of doing during the process was better communicating to people, because understandably, we're a very small community as a whole, and the witnesses within my scope are a smaller part of that small community. For lots of people, I don't think did have that much direct experience of, well, I think this, but other people within my scope are sort of vehemently opposed to my position on it. And I think, although I'm very pleased with the reaction the report has got, one of the things I would do differently if I had my time over again is I would have been slightly better at going, okay, thank you very much for what you've told me. However, you should know that other people very much do feel the obverse. But I think the trick was to hold what everyone said and make sure that everyone's testimony got room to breathe. And what I hope I did well in the final version was balance those divisions without doing it in a way which kind of felt that anyone's views were being disrespected, in pointing out that there was a sort of perfect soil sample of the British Jewish community, really, within our witnesses' views and opinions on essentially everything.
I think you did amazingly well, because we know how many opinions there are. So to be able to manage them in the way that you've done, I take my hat off to you. But do you feel, amongst all of the many opinions that you had, was there anything that surprised or shocked you along the way that you can share anyway?
Yeah. So actually, the thing that sort of surprised me in terms of the diversity of opinions within the group was actually a very specific set of opinions, which again was something I had to reflect about in terms of my own blind spot. A very specific set of opinions about the wide variety of views that witnesses had about the state of Israel, which was a very moving and very long personal email sent to me by a member of the Ethiopian diaspora who's currently resident in the United Kingdom, who felt that Operation Solomon, which of course was the salvation of many Ethiopian Jews, was not being properly taught in either the synagogue they were currently going to or the school their children were going to. And I think, yeah, I knew about Operation Solomon obviously beforehand, but it was one of those things that I really hadn't thought about, and that really did. It was very useful for me in terms of how I approach a variety of other things in the report. But it was one of those things that I was really moved by just how much, for this person, the fact that this really important story was just completely absent from any advocacy about the state of Israel in our community, as far as they saw it. I don't think that's totally necessarily correct, but that was very much how they saw it. Completely absent from their kids' school and completely absent from anything being said at their synagogue, was something that I really hadn't expected, because it just was so far both from my own experience of racism in the United Kingdom, so far from many of the initial things that people who'd sort of come forward and therefore inspired the creation of the commission had said, but also ironically, because one of the things I did right from the get-go, if you're looking for how do you tackle some of these challenges within our community, well, you look to the largest single concentration of our community, which is the state of Israel, for bits of good practice, and there are bits of those learnings and are in the final report's recommendation. But of course, that is not something that came up, because that has something that's been being observed by the state of Israel for more than a decade, and that I think was something that's really stayed with me. And it's one of the reasons why I knew right from the get-go that I was going to recommend a level of observation of the 30th of November, but it did spur me away from my initial kind of thing of going, oh, well, 60 is slightly different, you can do it as part of a classroom lesson, to going, actually, no, that's a kind of knee-jerk reaction on my own part. I should go further on that. And so that's definitely something which surprised me and has stayed with me.
But it's good. I was asked as well quite a few questions about how that story is going to be told in schools, and what can we recommend to make sure people know. I could talk to you all night, but I know that after the next question, Rabbi Sybil is very anxious to ask you some questions, and she's got lots of questions. So I'm going to have to ask you our last question in conversation. What do you feel is the single most important takeaway of the report for the whole community as a whole?
I think and hope that the most useful takeaway for the community as a whole is the value of listening, is the value of this exercise in of itself. It was I know I've said this story, but I'm going to say, it was an incredibly far-sighted act by the board to do this in a sort of fairly open-ended way, to allow me to be driven by the testimony, and for us to reflect on what we could have done better without lapsing into what I think is quite a dangerous shift in how we across the United Kingdom debate this and discuss this stuff. We kind of sort of do this kind of sort of performative, oh, we're awful, we're terrible, it's awful, we should never do that again. Well, we never then go, and here's what we're going to do to stop doing it again. And we have sort of theoretically very high sanctions for bad behavior, but because they're so high, they are very rarely enforced. When they are enforced, they seem obviously unfair and over the top. In what will be my only sporting reference, if you follow cricket and you know about the case of Ollie Robinson, I think it's a pretty good case of something which just feels weirdly over the top, considering that sport's quite bad record of actually enforcing things which matter. And I hope that the value of sort of what in a very corporate sense I keep calling de-risked listening exercises, so just opportunities for organizations to take stock, think about what they've done, think about how what they've done well, what they've done badly, but to be able to reach frank conclusions about what they've done well and badly without feeling that everyone's going to shout at them, or what they need to do is do this kind of performative, oh, we're awful. And I hope then that stuff about the value of listening, and therefore that hopefully the value of the report as a whole, is the thing that will be the most useful and the community will most take to heart.
I feel you've been incredible, Stephen. You've been, as I say, so generous with your time. We couldn't have done this without you. We're all immensely grateful. And at the moment, we're drawing up an action plan to implement the 119 recommendations. We want to make sure that all your work was worthwhile and that it's a forever legacy. So again, from the bottom of my heart, Stephen, thank you for tonight as well. And I'm now going to hand over to Rabbi Sybil, who's got some more questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marie. That was great. And thank you to Stephen. It's not, I mean, I have loads of questions, but I don't want to hog the field. This is really a chance for you to ask questions, both of Stephen and of Marie. I'd like to ask you, please, not everybody's on mute at the moment. Can you please make sure you're muted unless you're going to ask a question? And it would be helpful, because there's so many, I'm not going to be able to see people raising their hands or whatever. If you have a question, please put it into the chat, and then I'll ask you to mute yourself in order to ask the question. But I know that I have, this is of course one of the advantages of doing this as a co-event, having spoken to Aviva Dorch, the Executive Director of Jewish Renaissance, in advance. And of course, she's been sharing this with me, that she asked whether she could ask the first question. So Aviva, can I go over to you for the question?
Sure, and thank you, Stephen and Marie, for all the work you've been doing. It's so appreciated. I grew up partly through the youth movement Habonim, and I was always aware that we were being given an education that was really about dialogue and working together. You know, we'd watch the films Cry Freedom or Mississippi Burning. We'd learn about Abraham Joshua Heschel marching alongside Martin Luther King. And the idea was that the Jewish community and the Black community had similar, if not the same, I mean, definitely not the same, but had similar positions that they were coming from as liminal, and should use those strengths to work together and support each other. I'd then go home, and I lived in Broughton Park, and I'd hear my grandmother, who in other ways was a lovely woman, calling the Black people living alongside us Schwarzers, and thinking absolutely nothing of it. So I wanted to ask a couple of things. First of all, is there any generational shift that came out within the report, or do you think the problems are still as entrenched? And I think my other question is, for those of us in the audience who haven't read it yet, can you give us some really kind of tackle some really practical examples of the kinds of issues you encountered that you think we need to face up to?
Thank you very, very much for that. I think in terms of the generational question, I sort of think in some ways, for both good and bad reasons, the picture hasn't changed all that much, right? And so that my great-grandfather loved me very much, not least because in terms of his lifetime, I was the only great-grandchild around. There are now more, but there weren't. Unfortunately, he didn't get to meet any of the others. He loved me to pieces, which sadly for me also involved him showing me his budgie, which I was very terrified of. But he would also talk about how, the blacks had ruined Roman Road Market and ruined the East End and had ruined Shepherd's Bush Market, where he'd had his second store. And I think the challenge for all of us is always to hold both of those truths equally in our mind, right? My great-grandfather loved me very much and was in essentially every way the ideal great-grandfather, but he also held views that were entirely in keeping within his time, but thankfully in the future we just see as almost comically racist, right? And yeah, and we can never be certain that the future will be better and more enlightened than the past. We have to work very hard and be very vigilant to ensure that this is the case. But all of us have are much more compassionate with what we can see in the people we know closely than we are with abstracts and big groups. And hopefully, if we work hard and we do our jobs right, we hold a number of views that our great-grandchildren will look back and go, wow, God, great-granddad Stephen had some pretty rogue positions, didn't he? And I think then across our witnesses' experiences and across there's essentially people who hold a variety of views than it would be ideal if they didn't, who are mostly trying not to and are allowing themselves to be shaped by their experience, right? I imagine that my great-granddad became less, he still said this thing, but believed them less as a result of having a dark-skinned great-grandson who he loved very much. So yeah, I think in some ways not very much change, but I actually think the most important thing about not very much change is, as you say, your grandmother was lovely and held lots of other lovely views, and to hold that potential for change and self-improvement within all of us. In terms of the sort of specific challenges for people who haven't read the report, I'm going to focus specifically on security because it was the only one that our witnesses didn't have a multiplicity of views on. Obviously, we know that unfortunately, our community does face a serious terrorist threat, and then therefore security is part of the continuation and flourishing of Jewish life. And then that threat comes from what the CST describes as being across the threat picture. So jihadists who can look like anybody, but do obviously recruit most effectively from people who have, who are, well, obviously all jihadists are Muslim, but therefore obviously recruit primarily from people who are born Muslim, or they do also recruit across the skin color barrier in prisons. And then neo-Nazis who obviously recruit from a rather tighter range of racial groups. And the CST advises that racial profiling doesn't work, it's counterproductive, and advises behavioral profiling, and is very robust on this in both their training and their own advocacy. But we know that it does sometimes happen. And we also know that particularly, if like me, you're someone who only turns up to synagogue when there's, exciting food on offer. We know that understandably at big set piece events where there is also more of a threat, there is also therefore an understandable nervous and anxiety around strangers at shul. But the two things that I think can really improve that while still having high and necessary levels of security are firstly to have a separate person whose job it is to think about welcome once everyone is inside the shul, right? And inside the synagogue, right? It's to have someone whose job it is to think of, you have to just go, okay, now you're inside, who's the person who's in charge of welcoming you and thanking you? And then also just basic things like the security person should be told to wish everyone a fraternal Shabbat Shalom at the end of it when they've come through the process. And then the second is for transparency around complaints. So when people do have a difficult experience, they know who they can complain to, and that complaint can eventually, if necessary and where necessary, be escalated up to the experts in security provision, which are, of course, the CST. There are many, many more recommendations, but as I say, I've picked that one because it is the one which had genuine unanimity in terms of experience, huge gratitude for the existence of security in our spaces, but also difficulty in ways people were treated that can be very easily rectified while still maintaining a high security approach.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Ian Lancaster, who is the chair of Jewish Renaissance, I think has two questions, one for you, Stephen, and one for Marie. Ian, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Sybil. Stephen, Marie mentioned that you made 119 recommendations in the report, if I heard her correctly. Could you just pick out one or two key ones to share with us? And then what I'd like to ask Marie is what the board is doing to implement those recommendations.
So Stephen, if you want to go first, and Marie, if you want to unmute yourself then.
Right, so the two recommendations, because one of the reasons why there's so many is that they sort of span communal life. I don't think there are many organizations who have more than probably 10 or 15 at the absolute maximum, and I think it's actually far less than that on average for the average organization or voluntary group or whatever. But I'm going to go again for two of the ones with the sort of most broad applicability. The first is that an organization should observe 30th of November, which is the day to mark the expulsion of Jews from the Arab countries of the Middle East. Many of our witnesses, either, maybe they have one parent themselves, or they are children, or in the case of one of witnesses, they are adopted by two people for whom this is true, came here in the 60s and 70s as a result of that expulsion. And it's something which often isn't marked. It's often in some ways a source of great unhappiness. If your parents are buried in another country, or if your parents are buried in another country and the graveyard has since been desecrated, and all of the all of the particular difficulties and tragedies as the kind of ill-managed collapse of the British Empire led to a cold and hostile climate for Jews across the Middle East outside of the state of Israel. And again, I recommend that in large part because for those of you who are involved in any form of organization, that is the one which will be most applicable. And then the other applicable one is this one about regular listening exercises. Now, not just for issues of race and ethnic diversity, because one of the things that was very humbling is throughout this process, throughout this process, I'd received messages beginning with, I'm not sure if this is within your scope, and then it would very obviously be within the scope, or it would be something where it was within the scope because they themselves were within our scope, but it was clearly not something that was really directly relevant, but it was an important thing that happened to them. And then sometimes something wasn't within our scope at all, but it was still important, and they clearly had never felt and there was anyone else they could tell it to. And so I really recommend that all organizations find opportunities to just talk to the people they work with and go, look, how do you feel we're doing? Is there anything you'd like to talk about? Because I think it's very easy for all of us. We see this with the magazine I work for. If at the start of this process you'd said to me, people find it hard to complain, I go, would then it was so. But actually, I think then those of us, and I include myself, as I would say I'm someone who's a good complainer. I think one of the problems is those of us who are good complainers are not actually particularly representative of people who are quite nervous about complaining, who are nervous about coming forward. And one of the things I really recommend is all organizations, again, not just within the scope of what I've been tasked to look over, but just in general, do have regular events where they, in a sort of non-risky way, go, hey, if you have something you want to get off your chest, now's the time. Because I think that's a good way for organizations to learn and grow. There are, of course, 117 other recommendations, but those are the two I would single out with the broadest applicability.
Thank you. And Marie, what is the board going to be doing about the recommendations?
Right, well, of course, I won't say it was easy getting the report. It was a strictly difficult task, but we've got to make sure that the recommendations are actually implemented, which is going to be very difficult. I mean, some of the terms of the report can be very straightforward. For example, it's absolutely offensive. We heard Stephen say that Black Jews were referred to as Schwarzes. We can tell members of the community straight away they're not to do that, that's racist, etc. But to actually have the recommendations implemented, we need strategic plans. So the board at the moment is drafting an action plan, which will then have to go out for consultation, which broadly needs to be divided into, firstly, representation, leadership in the community. Then we need to have a whole section on how can we create welcoming communal spaces so that people feel welcome. Then we have to look at another section, training, where we can look at policies, we can look at attitudes, and we also need to look at education. What should people be taught in schools? So I think that they are very, very big pieces of work in terms of visibility in communal bodies. Any underrepresented people, women, Black Jews have got to come forward. We already have at the Board of Deputies now a Black deputy, but we've got to encourage people to make sure that they run programs and campaigns to encourage absolutely everybody to come forward. And for example, one of the things that we could recommend, of course we can't force this, is that one trustee should have specific responsibility for making sure that there is diversity, and we've also got to look at how Jewish organisations can represent the concerns of a racially diverse community. This is going to be a very, very big piece of work, because whenever we consider planning, we consider actions, we need to consider the viewpoints of all Jews, including Black Jews, and to make sure that the principles of anti-racism and the celebration of diversity are embedded across the whole communal architecture. And I think we need to make use of the communal media, and we need to challenge the norms. So the short answer is that in the 4 areas that I've given, the Board of Deputies is going to draw up a very long strategic action plan in relation to the 119 recommendations. Some of them will be quite easy. Some of them are more important immediately. For example, when people go to synagogues, that they need to be made welcome, but others are going to be more long-term and strategic, how we can have better representation and what is taught in schools. So that's what we're going to be concentrating on, is drawing up the action plan to make sure that the findings are implemented.
Thank you. Jenny Jankel, you have your hand raised if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, it's not a question, it's a suggestion. I work very closely with Lynn Julius, and on Stephen's very important first question, I have a Mizrahi daughter-in-law. Lynn is such an expert in this world, and bringing the 30th November, we've been at the Jewish Music Institute, which I run, we've been working with JW3 before COVID to mark this absolutely important date. So I think bringing Lynn Julius on board, the organization Harif is extremely knowledgeable, and Lynn has traveled the world. It was just a...
Can I just to thank you, can I just to save you on that, can I say that Harif is a member of the Board of Deputies already, but Lynn Julius decided to stand down as a deputy, which is unfortunate. But I don't know if you know Edwin Shuker. He was our Vice President of our Communities Division.
Yeah.
He is still a deputy and very, very involved, and he's already giving a huge amount of talks in relation to Mizrahi Jews, and Harif is still a member. So those organisations and people have been consulted, and Edwin Shuker as well was a witness. So that's already happened. So it will continue.
We work closely with him. Sorry if it's already been done, but I just happened to...
No, you wouldn't know. But as I say, Lynn Julius has decided to step down as a deputy, but we still have Edwin Shuker.
Thank you. Actually, you have answered one of the questions that I was going to ask, which is, thinking about this, yes, I would love to arrange for my community something for the 30th of November, but I know nothing about it. And the question is, where do we rabbis get that sort of information? So thank you Jenny, you've half answered that for me. I have another question, though, I'd like to ask. As a rabbi, because I know one of the recommendations in the report was that, we should be speaking much more about the issues of sort of racial diversity and about the diverse members of our community. But I have to say, personally, I'm quite sort of hesitant for fear of using the wrong language. And I wondered whether you had any sort of suggestions of, what one should do about that, or what we should do about that. Is it better to say it and say it crassly, or are there ways that we can learn how to actually learn to use the right language in this
Well, you might want to consider unconscious bias training. We've done that at the Board of Deputies. That's something that I think would be a really good start, and we can certainly recommend the person that we've used, because a lot of people don't realise what they're saying, and then to realise the implications of it, I think it would be a very good starting point. But I'm sure Stephen's got some other.
Yes, I think, Stephen, you weren't that keen on unconscious bias training.
No.
Yeah, well, I think, it's clear that, I've sat on the board and it was very useful, and it's clearly been very useful for some people, and if people want to do it, then they should go right ahead. I specifically did not recommend it in terms of some of the security challenges, because the evidence, unfortunately, is that in terms of moving someone on that journey who is not already there, it doesn't really seem to work. I think it can be very useful if you're an organization that, wants to think about how it makes a new hiring process or how it approaches something. But I think in terms of your specific question about language, I think look, one of the things our witnesses really didn't agree on was language, right? For some people, they found the construction, Jews of color and people of color in general, they really didn't like it. For some people, they found that a very welcoming one. For some people, they didn't like it, but they thought there was nothing better available. We even had different opinions about whether or not the capital B and whether or not Black Jews should be capital B, capital J, or lowercase b, uppercase J, or lowercase b, lowercase J. I think really there is never a solution on the question of do I prefer to be a Steve, a Stevie, or a Stephen? Obviously, it's easier in the age of Zoom to know which one I am without asking. But I think on language, people can pretty much always pick up on intent. And I think it's kind of always better to sort of speak and be willing to refine to what other people are comfortable with. For example, as someone who myself is a bit personally about off color, I accept them for people, including some people ideally love it, a term that they're very comfortable with and they like using. So I'm not going to sort of, have a dispute with them about it. The only way is to kind of use the language you're comfortable with, and then kind of meet whoever you're speaking to in the middle, which I think is true in essentially every walk of life on sort of every issue, really.
I confronted this actually in the title of this whole series, which was going to be Black Jewish Lives Matter, until people pointed out that there is a nervousness around, Black Lives Matter and its sort of attitude to Israel, so that we shortened it to Black Jewish Lives. But I had a very strong objection to one of our presenters in the second part, who's really looking at some of the African Jewish communities, saying, you cannot call them Black. African Jews are not Black. And so we have actually, as a compromise, we kept to the Black Jewish Lives for the first two of the series, which are really relating to the UK. But for the other 5, we're sort of switching to the term African Jewish Lives in an attempt not to ruffle any feathers. But it does seem something of a minefield, and that's only the start of it. And I mean, I think the unconscious language in other places can be really quite hard. But I'm aware that time is pressing. We want to finish.
Sorry, can I just say one thing that Stephen, did say that's very important, and I agree. It's not negotiable when Jewish people come to synagogue and they're treated differently or not let in. The unconscious bias, I just want to agree with you, is not relevant there, because that needs immediate training. So that sort of behaviour making it difficult and not being welcoming. That should be something, I think, that should be one of the first things that is addressed. I don't put that into the unconscious bias. That's just they've got to behave differently immediately.
Absolutely. I'd like to turn to Aviva, who is going to tell us something, a little bit of the program that Jewish Renaissance is involved in.
Oh. Well, thank you very much, Sybil, Marie and Stephen. I was really pleased. I took over as Executive Director of Jewish Renaissance a year ago, and I was really delighted when I looked through the past 20 years of the archives to see how diverse the articles were, that there was a huge chunk of Sephardi material. We have a Sephardi Voices feature in every issue, that we were featuring stories of people like Una King, recently Nadine Batchelor Hunt. You know, it was exciting to me. And then I realized that suddenly I was talking about the content of the magazine and the stories that were being told, while envisaging the audience being the Ashkenormative white English Jewish community reading them. And for me, that is one of the problems that, and what Stephen really has been opening up, that we tend to think that it's us and them, or that we are the audience and we will work with the Black community. And we actually forget how much of the Jewish community is diverse, is Sephardi, Mizrahi, Black, and that you are us. You know, this isn't about us telling stories of the other, but this is about telling our own stories of our community. And I'm really proud that Jewish Renaissance we've committed to continuing our Diverse Voices project. And I have to thank the Danger Foundation, because a lot of that is thanks to David Danger and Sephardi Voices. But I also want to say that we're now thinking in two ways, which is that kind of width of what our Jewish community and Jewish world is, and then as the entire Jewish community, how we then work with the Black non-Jewish community, which is a separate issue as well. So we're really happy that we're partnering with Lyons Learning to do both those things in this series. Next week, we've got some more Black British voices, and we're going to actually hear people's stories. So it's been fantastic hearing about the policy, but I think you most understand someone when you hear their voice and you empathise with them. And then, as Sybil said, we're going to go on to travel around the world to Uganda, Ethiopia, Southern Africa, and actually hear about the wider diverse Jewish community around the world. So really excited that's happening, but also knowing us committing to this and saying we'll do it's only the start. So if you have things that you would like to see us do, or if you have things that you want to tell us that we should be either telling the stories of, or we should be in dialogue with, please contact us at Jewish Renaissance or Sybil at Lyons Learning, and we'll do the best to kind of develop that over the next couple of years.
Thank you, Aviva. And finally, Stephen Moss, who is the chair of the trustees of the Lyons Learning Project, and I know a member of Jewish Renaissance, is going to give a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Sybil. And what a fascinating hour we've had. I've learnt a lot, and looking forward now to reading the report in full. So as Aviva said, this is the first of the series. We have 7 altogether, and they run every Sunday pretty well through to late July. And they do cover a wide range of different voices, and I'd commend the series to you and hope that you'll join it. It's a great example of the collaboration between Sybil and our colleagues at Lyons Learning with Aviva and her team at Jewish Renaissance, and we're delighted to be working on this together. And so I'm sure there'll be more of that in the future. And in the meantime, I just want to say a huge thank you to Stephen Bush and indeed to Marie van der Zyl for sparing their time this evening and for really opening up the conversation that I think will be happening right across the community once we get the recommendations out and the strategy out. It's a huge challenge to get this right, and certainly at my own shul at West London Synagogue, which is a very diverse community, I have no doubt will be watching that space very, very carefully. And Marie is indeed a member, so we will have to watch it. Get that over the knuckles. So really, a huge thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. It's been great to have so many of you with us, and I hope that we'll see you all again next Sunday and the Sundays that follow for a really fascinating trip through, as we've said, through Ethiopia and Africa, listening to different voices and different stories of different Jewish communities across the globe. So thank you all for coming to this event, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Many thanks and have a great evening.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Lovely to see you all tonight and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you. Bye.